Hurry it up, men. We must be loaded before noon.
This one is heavy. Watch your footing.
More supplies coming through on the left. Get this loaded now. Heave! Watch your step in the mud. We need more rope over here.
Check item 42, Lieutenant.
42 confirmed, Captain. Moving to the next crate.
Check item 42, Lieutenant.
42 confirmed, Captain. Moving to the next crate.
January 1945. Western Front, near the Belgian-German border. The road is never silent. Even in the early hours before dawn, when frost hardens the mud and breath turns white in the dark, the sound continues. Engines, gears, tires grinding against frozen earth. A thin ribbon of headlights cuts through the trees, one after another, stretching far beyond what the eye can follow. From a shallow slit trench just off the road, a German infantryman watches. He has been here all night. He has watched since yesterday. He has watched for days. The trucks do not slow. Canvas-covered beds sway as they pass. Fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, repair lorries, medical trucks marked with red crosses. Each vehicle spaced carefully, deliberately, as if following a pattern only the drivers can see. When one disappears into the darkness ahead, another immediately replaces it. There is no pause, no break in the flow. The soldier has fought across France. He has retreated through Belgium. He has learned to read the rhythm of Allied attacks. Artillery, silence, then movement. But this is different. This road never empties. He realizes, slowly, that he is not watching an operation. He is watching a system, one that does not sleep, one that does not tire. And as the trucks continue east, unbroken and unstoppable, he understands something unsettling. This war is being carried forward on wheels, and nothing he has left can stop them. Behind those headlights lies the reason the front keeps moving. When the Second World War began in September 1939, most armies still imagined war in terms shaped by the previous conflict. Railways would move men and material. Horses would haul guns and wagons forward. Supplies would arrive in pulses, stockpiled before offensives, rationed during pauses. Speed mattered, but endurance was secondary. Few planners believed a modern army could remain in constant motion for months at a time. Germany built its early victories around that assumption. The Wehrmacht's doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, relied on rapid breakthroughs supported by concentrated logistics. Rail lines would be repaired quickly behind advancing units. Horse-drawn wagons, still used in vast numbers, would bridge the final distance to the front. Fuel and ammunition would be pushed forward just long enough to sustain decisive operations. Once the enemy collapsed, the war would effectively be over. In Poland and France, this system appeared to work. But beneath the victories lay a constraint. German logistics were efficient, disciplined, and fragile. More than half of the Wehrmacht's transport capacity depended on horses. Motor vehicles came in hundreds of models, many civilian, each requiring different parts. Fuel was limited, increasingly scarce, and often reserved for combat units at the expense of supply formations. The system could surge, but it could not flow continuously. The United States entered the war with a different inheritance. Long before Pearl Harbor, American military planners had studied a problem few European armies prioritized: how to sustain forces across oceans, continents, and undeveloped terrain. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, shaped by experiences in World War I and peacetime logistics exercises, assumed that American soldiers would fight far from home, supplied almost entirely by industry rather than local resources. This assumption shaped everything. American logistics doctrine emphasized standardization. Trucks were designed to be interchangeable, reparable in the field, and operable by minimally trained drivers. Spare parts were unified. Tires, engines, transmissions, all built to be swapped quickly, often roadside. Where Germany adapted civilian vehicles to military use, the United States produced military vehicles from the ground up. By 1941, American factories were already producing trucks in numbers unmatched by any nation on Earth. The GMC CCKW, the 2.5-ton Deuce and a half, became the backbone of this system. Rugged, simple, and reliable, it could carry ammunition, fuel, rations, bridge components, or wounded men. It could operate on poor roads, in mud, sand, or snow. And most importantly, it could be produced in staggering quantities. By war's end, more than 500,000 would be built. American planners did not view trucks as auxiliary equipment. They viewed them as the Army's bloodstream. This philosophy was reinforced by geography. The United States had no choice but to master logistics. Every soldier sent overseas required shipping space, food, fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment, all delivered across thousands of miles of ocean. Failure meant isolation. Success meant abundance. As early as 1942, U.S. Army manuals emphasized uninterrupted supply flow rather than stockpiling. The goal was not to dump supplies at the front, but to keep them moving. Roads were treated as arteries. Traffic control units were trained to manage constant movement. Engineers were tasked not just with building bridges, but with keeping routes open under all conditions. This approach began to prove itself in North Africa. During Operation Torch, American forces confronted harsh terrain, long distances, and limited ports. Mistakes were made. Convoys stalled. Units ran short. But the response was not retreat, it was adaptation. More trucks were assigned. Routes were improved. Traffic discipline was enforced. By the end of the Tunisian campaign, American supply columns were moving day and night, feeding advancing units faster than German forces expected. German observers took note. A report from Africa described American logistics as inexhaustible, not efficient in the traditional sense, but relentless. Where German supply lines thinned with distance, American lines thickened. Where shortages forced pauses, American units pressed on. By 1943, this difference was no longer theoretical. As Allied forces prepared to return to Western Europe, the United States was no longer merely sending divisions across the Atlantic. It was exporting an entire industrial rhythm, one built on continuous movement, mechanical endurance, and an assumption that the road itself could be weaponized. And when American troops would finally land in France, they would bring that rhythm with them, engine by engine, mile by mile. By the time Allied planners turned their full attention to Western Europe, the war had already exposed the limits of traditional supply thinking. Campaigns were no longer decided by a single breakthrough or a rapid collapse. They were decided by how long an army could move, fight, and replace losses without stopping. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 offered an early warning. The island's narrow roads and limited ports forced Allied logisticians to improvise. Trucks ran continuously from beaches to inland units. Traffic jams became battles of their own. Military police stood at intersections day and night, directing convoys like conductors guiding an orchestra. The lesson was unmistakable. Modern warfare did not pause for resupply. Resupply had to keep pace with combat. Italy deepened that lesson. As Allied forces pushed north against stubborn German defenses, terrain replaced distance as the enemy. Mountains channeled roads into narrow corridors. Bridges were destroyed as soon as they were crossed. German rear guards understood that if they could slow the flow of supplies, they could halt entire armies. Yet the trucks kept coming. American engineers rebuilt bridges in hours. Road maintenance units resurfaced bombed routes under fire. Convoys adjusted their schedules, moving at night, in rain, in blackout conditions. The front advanced slowly, but it never starved. German intelligence officers began to note a pattern. American units rarely paused due to supply shortages. When attacks stopped, it was usually by choice, not necessity. These observations mattered when Normandy approached. Operation Overlord posed a logistical challenge unprecedented in scale. Millions of men would land on a coast with no major port. Everything, fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, would have to be moved inland over beaches and temporary harbors, then distributed across a devastated road network. German planners expected the Allies to choke on their own success. They believed that once Allied forces broke out of the beachhead, they would outrun their supply lines. Ports like Cherbourg would take months to repair. Railways would be shattered by bombing. Roads would become clogged, impassable targets for air attack. In German doctrine, such a situation forced operational pauses, windows of opportunity for counterattack. But American logistics doctrine did not assume pauses. In the months before D-Day, Allied staffs quietly planned for continuous movement. Traffic regulation plans were drawn down to individual intersections. Entire truck units were designated solely for long-distance hauling. Drivers were trained to operate with minimal rest, rotating in shifts. Maintenance crews were embedded directly into convoy routes. When the landings began on June 6, 1944, the system was tested immediately. At first, it faltered. Beaches jammed with vehicles. Supplies piled up faster than they could be moved. But within weeks, order emerged from congestion. Temporary roads were laid. Traffic flows were separated by direction. Convoys were assigned fixed routes and timetables. Then came the breakout from Normandy. In late July 1944, Operation Cobra shattered the German front. American and British forces surged into open country, advancing faster than any previous Allied movement in the war. Divisions covered distances in days that had taken weeks in Italy. For German commanders, this should have been the moment when Allied momentum collapsed. Instead, something unprecedented happened. As combat units surged forward, the supply system did not stretch thin. It expanded. Thousands of trucks flooded onto French roads. Routes were marked, guarded, repaired, and controlled with military precision. Drivers slept in their cabs, or not at all. Engines ran until they failed, then were replaced. Tires were changed by the roadside. Broken vehicles were pushed aside so the flow would not stop. German reconnaissance units reported columns of trucks moving without interruption. Interrogations of prisoners revealed the same disbelief. American soldiers complained of exhaustion, of long hours and poor food, but not of shortages. To German troops accustomed to rationed fuel and intermittent resupply, this was deeply unsettling. The front no longer felt like a line sustained from behind. It felt like a wave being pushed forward by an unseen force. Every mile of retreat revealed another road filled with trucks, another depot springing into existence overnight. By August 1944, the Allied advance was no longer limited by distance or destruction. It was limited only by how fast the supply columns could roll. And they were rolling faster than anyone had imagined. From this moment, The war in Western Europe ceased to be a contest of maneuver alone. It became a contest of endurance between an army that could move as long as the road existed and one that was slowly running out of the means to follow. That imbalance would soon be felt not just in strategy rooms, but in the trenches on the roadsides, and in the quiet moments when German soldiers counted Allied trucks and realized the number never reached an end. Behind every truck rolling east was a driver whose war rarely appeared in headlines. Most were young. Many had never driven anything larger than a farm vehicle before the army. Now they handled fully loaded trucks weighing several tons, often at night, under blackout conditions, on roads cratered by bombs and clogged with wreckage. Sleep came in fragments, minutes stolen while engines cooled, hours on the roadside if traffic halted. There was no front line for them. They drove through artillery zones. They passed burning vehicles. They learned to recognize the sound of incoming fire and when not to stop. Orders emphasized one thing above all else: keep moving. A stalled truck was more dangerous than an empty one. If hit, the driver was expected to pull off the road if possible. If not, the convoy flowed around the wreck. Letters home rarely described heroics. They described monotony, exhaustion, and the strange pressure of responsibility, knowing that a battalion's food, fuel, or ammunition sat in the bed behind them. When drivers collapsed from fatigue, replacements took their place without ceremony. German prisoners later remarked on this endurance. They expected truck drivers to flee under fire. Instead, they watched convoys continue even as roads were shelled. To them, it seemed less like courage and more like inevitability, as if the trucks would roll whether the men wanted them to or not. That impression was no accident. Angle 2, the machine. American trucks were not elegant. They were not fast. They were built to survive neglect. The GMC CCKW's engine could run for hours at low gear without overheating. Its suspension absorbed punishment that would cripple lighter vehicles. Most repairs could be done with basic tools. Parts were standardized so that a broken truck could be cannibalized to keep others running. Fuel efficiency mattered less than reliability. Breakdowns were planned for. Recovery teams followed convoys, pulling disabled vehicles aside so traffic would not slow. Tires, the single greatest vulnerability, were stockpiled in vast numbers. Changing one on the roadside became routine. German vehicles told a different story. The Wehrmacht operated hundreds of truck types, many requisitioned from civilian use. Spare parts were scarce. Fuel quality varied. A minor mechanical failure could immobilize a unit for days. As air attacks intensified, repair depots became targets, and replacements became impossible. To German soldiers watching American convoys, the difference was stark. Their own transport arrived in fits and starts. The Americans arrived in waves, each indistinguishable from the last. The truck was not just a vehicle. It was the embodiment of industrial warfare, predictable, replaceable, relentless. Angle 3, the German view. German frontline units quickly learned to fear silence more than noise. Silence meant the Americans were reorganizing. Noise meant they were advancing. Reports from infantry divisions in France and Belgium described constant motor traffic behind Allied lines. Night patrols counted vehicles until they lost track. Officers noted that American artillery fire rarely diminished, even after days of fighting. Some German soldiers assumed the trucks were a deception, moving in circles to exaggerate numbers. Others believed the Allies were consuming supplies recklessly and would soon collapse. They waited. The collapse never came. Interrogations of captured German officers reveal a recurring theme: disbelief. They had studied American industry. They knew the numbers on paper. But watching those numbers translate into endless traffic on narrow European roads was something else entirely. For men whose own units rationed fuel by the liter and ammunition by the day, the sight was psychologically crushing. It suggested not just strength, but permanence. The Americans were not borrowing momentum. They were manufacturing it. And as German troops retreated east, they carried that realization with them, mile after mile, road after road. That realization would soon intersect with the decisions made far above them. Decisions that would test whether even this seemingly endless system had limits. At the highest levels, Allied commanders understood that what appeared effortless at the front was the result of constant calculation behind it. Dwight D. Eisenhower did not see logistics as a supporting function. He saw it as command itself. His headquarters tracked fuel consumption, vehicle losses, road capacity, and repair rates with the same seriousness as enemy movements. Daily reports measured not only how far divisions advanced, but how many tons of supplies reached them. This focus shaped operational choices. When field commanders demanded faster advances, Eisenhower weighed their requests against the capacity of the roads behind them. He approved bold movements not because supply was abundant, but because it was continuous. The system could bend, drivers could be pushed harder, trucks could be diverted without breaking. German command culture was different. As fuel shortages worsened, German generals were forced to choose which units moved and which remained static. Entire formations were immobilized by lack of gasoline. Orders increasingly reflected desperation rather than planning. Counterattacks conceived without the means to sustain them. American commanders, by contrast, learned to think in flow rates rather than stockpiles. A unit did not need massive reserves if resupply was guaranteed tomorrow and the next day and the next. This mindset allowed for flexibility, speed, and sustained pressure. Angle 5. Fuel as a weapon. Fuel became the war's quiet arbiter. American forces consumed enormous quantities of gasoline. A single armored division could burn hundreds of thousands of gallons in days. Yet shortages were rare. Tankers rolled alongside ammunition trucks. Fuel dumps appeared overnight, then vanished as the front moved on. German fuel, by late 1944, was almost mythical. Synthetic plants had been bombed. Romanian oil fields were lost. What fuel remained was hoarded for emergencies. Training ceased. Vehicles were hidden to preserve gasoline. Orders specified movement only at critical moments. This imbalance shaped every encounter. German counterattacks stalled not because of enemy fire, but because tanks ran dry. Units abandoned vehicles they could not move. Captured American fuel was treated like treasure, yet often could not be used quickly enough to matter. German soldiers watching Allied convoys understood this disparity instinctively. Every passing fuel truck represented freedom of movement their own army no longer possessed. Angle 6. Roads, weather, and control. The environment should have favored the defenders. Autumn rains turned roads into mud. Winter frost shattered pavement. Bridges were destroyed repeatedly. Yet American logistics adapted rather than slowed. Engineers rebuilt crossings within hours. Gravel was dumped into craters as convoys waited. Routes were rotated to prevent collapse. Traffic discipline was absolute. Military police controlled intersections, enforced spacing, and redirected vehicles without debate. Drivers followed orders even when exhausted, because deviation threatened the entire flow. The road became a controlled space, a temporary, moving infrastructure that existed only as long as the trucks used it. German forces lacked this control. As units retreated, roads clogged with refugees, wounded, and mixed formations. Supply and combat traffic competed for space. Air attacks turned congestion into catastrophe. What little movement remained became chaotic and unpredictable. By contrast, Allied roads pulsed with rhythm. To German observers, this order was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. It suggested not improvisation, but mastery. Not desperation, but confidence. And yet, even the most disciplined system can be strained. By late 1944, the distance from Normandy beaches to the front had stretched hundreds of miles. Fuel consumption soared. Vehicles wore out faster than they could be replaced. The question no longer asked whether American supply could keep moving. It asked how long it could do so under relentless pressure. That question would be answered not in planning rooms, but in the cold forests and narrow roads where the war's momentum would either stall or surge forward once more. By September 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had reached a velocity no planner had originally intended. In less than 3 months, American forces had driven from the beaches of Normandy to the borders of Germany. Cities fell in rapid succession. German units retreated faster than they could reorganize. Maps and Allied headquarters were updated daily, sometimes hourly, as front lines refused to stay still. But beneath the momentum, strain was building. The distance from the Normandy supply depots to the forward units now stretched more than 300 miles. Ports remained damaged or insufficient. Railways, though slowly being repaired, could not yet bear the full weight of the advance. Everything still depended on trucks, tens of thousands of them, running almost without pause. This was the moment German commanders had been waiting for. They believed the Allied system would finally snap under its own weight. Fuel consumption reached staggering levels. Tires wore down faster than replacements arrived. Engines failed after months of continuous use. Drivers pushed beyond exhaustion. Maintenance units cannibalized damaged vehicles to keep others moving. Roads, never designed for such traffic, began to crumble under the load. Yet the flow continued. In response to the mounting crisis, Allied logisticians made a decision that would define the campaign. Supplies would no longer be distributed evenly. Priority would be given to formations driving toward Germany's industrial heartland. Everything else would wait. This was not an act of abundance. It was an act of calculation. Entire supply routes were reorganized. Traffic was stripped of redundancy. Convoys ran on fixed schedules with ruthless efficiency. Non-essential movements were halted. The system narrowed, but did not stop. German intelligence detected the concentration immediately. Reconnaissance reports described unprecedented motor traffic along specific axes. Night skies glowed with the reflected light of headlights and burning engines. Air attacks were ordered against supply columns, but Allied air superiority limited their effect. Fighter bombers guarded the roads by day. Anti-aircraft guns rode with convoys. German commanders now faced a paradox. The Allies were clearly overextended, yet they were still advancing. Every delay inflicted by German resistance was met not with pause, but with reinforcement. Artillery fire intensified. Tank units refueled and returned to action within hours. Infantry received food and ammunition with unnerving regularity. Nowhere was this more visible than in the buildup toward Germany's western defenses. As American units approached the Siegfried Line, German soldiers watched the roads behind the enemy thicken with traffic. Supply dumps appeared in forests and fields almost overnight. Wounded men were evacuated even as replacements arrived. The front did not thin, it solidified. For German frontline troops, the realization was devastating. They were not fighting an army advancing on momentum alone. They were fighting an engine that converted distance into pressure. Every mile surrendered only shortened the Allied supply routes and strengthened the next blow. Yet German leadership still believed one option remained. If the Allied supply system could not be destroyed from the air or disrupted from the rear, perhaps it could be severed at the front, not by attrition, but by shock. A sudden blow, deep enough and violent enough, might fracture the roads and paralyze the flow. That belief would give birth to a final gamble, and it would test, more brutally than ever before, whether the American trucks truly could not be stopped. In December 1944, the gamble was launched. The Ardennes Offensive, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, was conceived not as a traditional counterattack, but as a logistical ambush. German planners understood they could not defeat the Allies head-on. Instead, they aimed to rupture the arteries that fed the front. The Ardennes was chosen precisely because it seemed unsuitable for mass movement. Dense forests, narrow roads, poor weather. If American supply columns could be trapped, delayed, or destroyed here, the entire Allied advance might stall. German units advanced under strict fuel limits. Orders were explicit: capture Allied fuel dumps intact or abandon vehicles when empty. The offensive depended not on German abundance, but on American surplus. For a brief moment, it appeared to work. Snow fell heavily. Fog grounded Allied aircraft. Roads clogged with retreating units and refugees. Some American convoys were ambushed. Others were forced to turn back. Infantry units at the front felt the pressure as supplies arrived more slowly than before. German soldiers began to believe the spell had finally broken. But the system did not collapse. Instead, it bent. American logisticians responded with the same principles that had carried them across France. Routes were rerouted within hours. Engineers cleared roads under fire. Truck units were reassigned en masse to critical sectors. Drivers who had been hauling rations one day carried ammunition the next. Fuel moved forward not in dumps, but directly to units in contact. The weather that shielded German armor also hardened roads, allowing trucks to move where mud would have stopped them weeks earlier. Convoys shifted to night movement. Traffic control units imposed order on chaos, reestablishing flow through bottlenecks the Germans believed impassable. German spearheads pushed west and ran dry. Tanks halted for lack of fuel within sight of their objectives. Crews abandoned vehicles they could not move. American fuel, captured in isolated dumps, proved insufficient to sustain momentum. The offensive slowed, then stalled. Meanwhile, the roads behind American lines filled once more. German reconnaissance reports grew increasingly desperate. They described Allied supply traffic resuming in great volume, even as fighting raged. Artillery ammunition expenditures remained high. Replacement units arrived on schedule. Wounded men were evacuated despite the chaos. By early January 1945, the counteroffensive had failed. The front stabilized. The bulge was crushed. And with it, Germany's last realistic chance to disrupt Allied logistics vanished. What German soldiers saw in the aftermath confirmed what they had begun to suspect months earlier. Even under surprise, weather, and direct attack, the American supply system recovered faster than it could be damaged. The trucks were still coming. For the men watching from frozen foxholes and shattered villages, this persistence carried a terrible clarity. It meant the enemy would not pause to regroup. It meant the front would move again, eastward. And this time, nothing stood behind it but the German homeland itself. The turning point had passed, not with an explosion or a surrender, but with the quiet, unstoppable return of engines to the road. That sound would follow the retreat all the way into Germany. When the Allied advance resumed in early 1945, it did so with a sense of inevitability that was impossible to ignore. German units were no longer retreating to regroup. They were retreating to survive. The Ardennes had consumed Germany's last operational reserves of fuel, armor, and trained manpower. Vehicles abandoned during the offensive littered the forests. Empty tanks, silent testimony to a strategy that had depended on seizing what the enemy possessed in abundance. Across the Rhine, the imbalance only widened. As American forces crossed into Germany, the supply lines that had once stretched precariously from Normandy now shortened with every mile gained. Captured rail yards were repaired and pressed into service. Ports along the Channel and in Antwerp finally reached full capacity. The truck routes that had once compensated for shortages now amplified abundance. The roads became denser with traffic, not thinner. German civilian and military observers described entire regions dominated by Allied movement. Villages saw convoys pass without interruption for days. Fuel dumps expanded into fields and forests. Engineer units repaired bridges faster than retreating forces could destroy them. For German soldiers, the psychological effect was profound. They had been trained to believe that wars were decided by bold maneuvers and decisive battles. Now, they faced an enemy whose strength lay in refusal to stop. Attacks failed not because of tactical brilliance alone, but because every loss was immediately replaced. Every delay was absorbed. Every roadblock was bypassed. Reports from German divisions increasingly referenced Allied logistics as an enemy in itself. Ammunition shortages forced German artillery to ration fire. Fuel scarcity immobilized units that might otherwise have counterattacked. Infantry formations were ordered to hold positions without hope of reinforcement or resupply. When orders came to withdraw, transport was often unavailable. In contrast, American units advanced with a consistency that bordered on the mechanical. They paused when ordered, not when compelled. When they moved, they did so with full rations, ammunition, and fuel. Wounded soldiers were evacuated quickly, reinforcing the belief that survival was possible. Another subtle advantage over an enemy whose wounded often remain behind. Numbers tell part of the story. By early 1945, Allied forces in Western Europe were moving tens of thousands of tons of supplies per day. Fuel alone flowed forward in quantities that exceeded total German production capacity. The sheer scale made disruption nearly impossible. Destroying a single convoy mattered little when another followed minutes behind. German attempts to harass supply lines grew increasingly symbolic. Small unit attacks on convoys caused local damage but failed to alter the flow. Air attacks were rare and ineffective. Sabotage could delay traffic for hours, not days. The system absorbed losses the way a river absorbs stones. As American troops pushed deeper into Germany, the meaning of the trucks changed. They were no longer just carriers of war. They became carriers of occupation, of food for civilians, medical supplies, and administrative units. Their presence signaled not just defeat, but transition. For many German soldiers, this was the moment the war truly ended in their minds. Not when a city fell or a leader gave an order, but when they realized the enemy's ability to move and sustain itself had become absolute. The war's final battles would still be fought. Lives would still be lost, but the outcome was no longer in question. And as the roads filled once more with the sound of engines, the last uncertainty drained from the retreating forces. By spring 1945, the consequences of uninterrupted supply had reshaped the Western Front entirely. The American logistical system, perfected through years of planning, industrial might, and relentless execution, had enabled a pace of operations the Germans could neither match nor disrupt. Frontline divisions received everything they needed to advance: ammunition for every engagement, fuel for armored units, rations for soldiers, and medical support for casualties. The trucks that had once been mere transport now defined the tempo of battle itself. German forces, by contrast, faced systemic collapse. Fuel shortages immobilized armored divisions. Artillery units lacked ammunition, and infantry formations were isolated from resupply. Even when German units attempted counterattacks, their movements were constrained by the scarcity of gasoline and the unreliability of vehicles. Logistics, which had always been the hidden backbone of any army, had failed them entirely. Captures of German officers and post-war interrogations reveal a recurring theme: disbelief. Many marveled at the Americans' ability to keep supply moving through destroyed infrastructure, flooded rivers, and constant weather challenges. Some admitted that the relentless convoy movement crushed morale as much as the battles themselves. To them, it seemed the enemy's strength was not just in numbers or firepower, but in its refusal to stop, a force that no single engagement could overcome. The roads themselves became instruments of warfare. Bridges repaired in hours, traffic controlled with military precision, convoys running day and night, all ensured that combat units remained mobile. Field improvisation, engineering ingenuity, and sheer persistence rendered German plans to slow or cut off supplies largely futile. In essence, the war had shifted from a contest of firepower and maneuver to a contest of continuous endurance, and the Americans had mastered it. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the implications of this logistical supremacy were clear. Allied supply lines had not only supported the rapid advance into German territory, they had allowed the army to absorb losses, maintain pressure, and ensure operational flexibility to the very end. Analysts later noted that this ability to keep forces moving was as decisive as any battlefield victory. The war had been won as much by engines and drivers as by bullets and bombs. As trucks rolled into the heart of Germany, supplying victory even as the enemy collapsed, a lesson was made undeniable. In modern warfare, logistics was no longer secondary. It was decisive, and the relentless pulse of supply that German soldiers had watched in disbelief had already written the war's final chapter. In the quiet that followed, long after the last shots echoed across the Rhine. The roads themselves seemed to tell a story. Endless ribbons of asphalt and dirt had carried more than supplies. They had carried momentum, endurance, and inevitability. Where artillery, tanks, and infantry failed to break the enemy, the hum of engines and the persistence of trucks had carried the day. The American supply system had become an unseen weapon, invisible yet unstoppable. For soldiers who survived the war, it was a lesson in modern warfare. Victory depended not only on courage or strategy, but on the ability to sustain life, firepower, and movement over unimaginable distances. The trucks and the men who drove them embodied a truth few had grasped at the outset, that industrial capacity, discipline, and organization could decide battles before guns were even fired. For German troops, watching the seemingly endless convoys was a confrontation with inevitability itself. No single ambush, no heroic counterattack could match the persistence of engines rolling day and night. The war had been mechanized not just in weapons, but in movement, and the psychological weight of witnessing such unstoppable motion weighed as heavily as the battles themselves. Today, historians recognize that these logistics operations reshaped military doctrine. The lessons of continuous supply, road discipline, and rapid engineering became central to post-war planning, NATO strategies, and modern mechanized warfare. Yet beyond the technical achievements, there's a quieter human truth. Victory often hinges on endurance, on the will to keep moving when all else seems impossible, and on the countless, nameless individuals who make it happen. The war was decided on the roads as much as on the battlefields, and those roads, filled with trucks that never stopped, carried not just men and material, but the very momentum of history itself.